Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hi, welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Monica Ortiz Uribe. My guest today is writer and filmmaker Valentin Sandoval. He's best known for works that illuminate a life that straddles both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, including his latest. It's a book of narrative poetry called South Sun Rises. Welcome, Valentin.
Thank you. Thank you.
So tell us about this book. What is it about, and what inspired you to write it?
The story is story of my mom and my father essentially coming up north. It's I think it's a fresh take on the immigrant story without having to be stereotypical of a Latino experience. It's just a real take on my mom and my father, and how it is that they came north, and my father passing away when I was a baby, and my mom having to come up here on her own to be a single parent and with 4 kids in El Paso on the border. So that's essentially the story.
And speaking of a fresh take, one of the things you notice about the book right away is that it's a story, but it's not told in a traditional story form. It's told in poems. So every page is a different poem, but it's all part of the same story. Tell me a little bit about the structure of the book and why you chose it.
Well, for one, I went to Manhattan about 6 years ago to go with a manuscript in hand, and I went there with legendary Miguel Algarin, who started the Nuyorican Poets Cafe in the '70s with Bob Dylan and Tony Spiller, who an American Award-winning author. And I go with my manuscript, and the manuscript I had was just not strong enough, right? They tell me we're not going to publish this. It's no good, So I'm up there, and I have to deal with the heartache of hearing that kind of response, rejection, absolutely. And but we go out and have dinner. I'm there for 3 days. I'm going to make the best of it, and I tell a story indirectly of my mother and my dad, and how they came together, and how we came to the U.S. And they were enthralled. They were like, "Wow, that's a great story. That's a story there. If you can write that into a story, then we can help you publish it." And in the back of my mind, I'm like, "Well, that's going to be my second book." But and I tell them that, they're like, "Well, you don't even have a first book. You got to get it going." So within like 2-3 days, I came up with the first 40-50 pages of the manuscript, and it became very easy because it was just telling the story of my mom and my father, how I recollected it from it being passed down from aunts, uncles, my brother, my mom, and just piecing that together in a way that was still poetry, but I was hoping for that to segue and foreshadow a novel in the future. So.
And why did you decide on poetry as form versus traditional?
Because I appreciate lyricism and the elliptical nature of poetry. You're able to to sort of not have to live within the confines of what a novel is, but rather you can be abstract at the same time concrete. So it was wanting to play with poetry, because at the end of the day, I am a poet, and I wanted to tell a story in poetry. So, and I was inspired by people like Cecilio Camarillo and Juan Rulfo and and Jimmy Baca. When I read this in Santa Fe at Collected Works, one of the guys that was there tells me, like, "Wow, that's the first time I ever heard like a poetic narrative." I'm like, "Well, it's been done before." I wasn't like breaking new ground. I was breaking new ground on my story, but the style itself, it's been done before. I just did my take on that.
And it's also on one side of the page we can read English, and on the opposite side it's Spanish.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. Why did you decide to do that?
That was at the once myself and Jim Aperture, my publisher out of Santa Fe, decided to get the book done, I asked him, I said, "Why don't we do a Spanish translation?" And he's like, "Okay, well, I don't want to hire somebody to do it." I said, why don't you let me take care of that? I'll work on that with friends of mine in El Paso and Juarez, and And I was lucky enough to have Dr. Cortázar, who had translated Jimmy Santiago Baca's Martina Meditations in the South Valley, liked the book itself. So he and I and Mabel Weber, his translator, got together. And it was really Mabel Weber and myself, and it was really Mabel Weber whose just eloquence in Spanish and her appreciation of my book in English was the impetus and the foundation for us getting together at coffee shops over a 7-month period to translate it and just to do our best to make it accessible to South and Central America and hopefully Europe. At the same time, I didn't want to lose the colloquialisms and the vernacular of it being a border town book, and border town book specific to El Paso, Juarez.
And it's almost a two books in one, because it's a different experience to read it in Spanish versus English. And I recall you mentioning that you wanted to keep the two languages pretty pure, and not go back and forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things is that some of the traditional Chicano literature is including Spanish within the English. It's sort of the pochoisms, the gaudiness of the language is the Spanglish is kind of the charm of it. While I didn't want to do that, I wanted to try to keep it as pure as I could to English and to Spanish. So, and even we talked about that. To call that a translation, it's not. I don't even think it's that, because I think translation, you think it's in reaction to. It's reacting to an initial language, but the Spanish was not reacting to the English. Rather, we understood the story and the visuals and the layout, but Mabel did a phenomenal job in just voicing it in a voice that was unique in and of itself and stood on its own. So it really is like two books.
Cool. So one of the first characters that you introduced us to, and that you've already mentioned, is your mother. She seems to be the main inspiration behind the book, the main character that leads us through the book. Tell us a bit about your mother. Where was she born, and what was her upbringing like?
She was born in Juarez, and she had 15 siblings. I think she was. I'm not sure where she stood in terms of more like the younger one, but not the youngest. It was a textured Juarez. My grandpa, they call him El Guy. Was a mechanic, but he seemed to, from what I hear, have respect from political figures in town. Somehow he was like a philosopher of sorts, right? And had a kind of a socialist slant to him, and so he was not for the church. And ironically, my mom was sort of anchored herself to the church for her sort of catharsis and her foundations. But her mom was killed, and I wasn't killed. She died, and when she was about 15 years old, and I think it was diabetes.
This is your grandma.
My grandma, yes. So she had maybe 4th, 5th grade education, in Juarez, and she had to find a way to live with her siblings and her sisters and her brothers, and find ways to educate herself. And it was a certain level of resiliency going on at her young age. At the same time, she always was emphatic to point that she was never taken by the streets. You had to be resilient enough. And at the same time, Juarez at that time was a different Juarez from now. So that was sort of her upbringing in essence. Yeah.
And tell us about your father. You don't remember your father, but he seems to be a character in and of itself.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine, a poet from up in Albuquerque, and he's a big aficionado of Kerouac and On the Road, and in a sense, I tell him, at the risk of sounding pretentious, I tell him, I said, my book is my own attempt of searching for my father. And if you recall the novel On the Road, Kerouac and Neal Cassady were pursuing Neal Cassady's father. They were searching for him the whole time. And in that search, it was what the book was about. The journey was the book, right? And so that's similar to mine. I don't know my father. I have family I don't even know about in Juarez, and I have maybe one image of him that I recall.
And you do a very good job of painting that image in the book. Can you describe the first time that your mom saw your dad, or where she met him?
I really got that more from my aunt, Cecilia, because she's the one that knew him, pretty well. And she tells me he was tall, he was a big guy, he was 6'2", 6'3", and he had long hair. They called him El Argentino, you know, they thought
The
he
Argentine.
was, the Argentine. And apparently he learned how to play guitar in the streets. You know, he didn't, almost like a blues player, where he would just pick up broken bottle caps and teach himself how to play the guitar. So he became relatively famed within the restaurants and the bars in Juarez, you know, for being a very good guitar player. He was also a journalist, and he was a writer for Channel 5, KTLA, I think, whatever that is. It's a station in Juarez. I don't know if it's still there, but I know that much, you know, and she described that much to me, how he was very, you know, charismatic on stage and this and that. So I got more of the story of my father through my aunt, you know, as opposed to, I know his name was Hilario, I know last name was Hilario Ruiz, and I know those things, but in terms of having an image, you know, it was more, I got that more from my aunt.
Why from your aunt and not from your mother?
Because my mom, just her nature is she's both the mother and the father. She's, you know, she's loving but at the same time very stoic, you know. She's sensitive but harsh at the same time, you know. And my aunt was more like my friend, you know. She was just more the cool aunt that you have, you know, that you like.
She seems more open, more
Yes.
open to discussion. Okay, and how did your father die?
He was killed by the Rutera in Juarez, you know, which
The
is a
Rutera,
bus.
which is the
buses,
bus.
yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah, he was, apparently it was a car accident. He was coming out of the Kentucky bar and playing a show there, and you know, the truck, the car, I mean, the bus hit him. So that's how he died.
So what was it that your mother soon after decided to leave her life in Juarez and move to the United States, immigrate to the United States illegally? What drove her to make that decision?
You know, it's probably a whole series of things. I mean, for one, you know, she was, you know, the man she was in love with, you know, was, you know, probably, you know, I think he was seeing other women, and you know, she just wanted to find her own place. She just felt this sort of discontent to that Juarez. I think she had really had foresight in terms of recognizing that, you know, her dreams were not going to be fulfilled there in Juarez, or more than that, her children's dreams, that she had a better chance of providing a better future for her children crossing over to El Paso.
And it was a very dramatic crossing at that. She was led by a coyote, which is a smuggler, or the term for a smuggler. And I'd like you to read that in the book.
Sure.
So the coyote's name is called, his name is Manuel. And yeah, I'd like for you to read
Sure.
about their crossing and what happened.
Okay.
So we're picking up here. They're at the riverbank along the Rio Grande, and this is the method that they're gonna cross
Yes.
into El Paso.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So, beans with garlic and cilantro were their breakfast. Manuel dove into the river with the playfulness of a young kid. My mother walks in carefully, but soon finds herself swallowed by the water. He screams out, "Be careful with the underwater currents." "What?" I said, "Be careful with the currents." My mom continues carefully, but soon finds herself devoured by water and fear. And she doesn't know how to swim. The brown water swirled into her mouth as she spit it out, and she tried to breathe. And she dog paddled through the water, no longer even hoping to touch or push up from the bottom. I was pulled by the current like a demon lurking inside the water. I was pulled entirely into the river as my mouth was filled with water. "Manuel, Manuel, I'm drowning. Manuel, I'm drowning." And I was being pulled by the current, and I swear it felt like it was like a hand was pulling me in. Manuel swam back to my mom. He grabbed her by the hand, pushed her above water, swam under her body, carried her on his back like a boat searching for a solid ground. Manuel did not come up though. My mom was now able to crawl onto the ground, crying and screaming, "Manuel, Manuel, ¿en dónde estás, Manuel?" But he did not resurface until a ways down the river, his body floating off into the hills of the desert. The current seduced him under, drowned him, in exchange for saving my mother.
So very, very dramatic crossing.
Yeah.
Manuel didn't make it.
No, he did not. No. Yeah, and I was thinking it's an interesting point that Manuel was black. You know, he was a black coyote, And you know, that's one of the stories that my mom told me from, you know, out of her mouth, how she crossed over in the 70s, and you know, so that seemed to be a more common thing, where you saw a lot of, you know, immigrants crossing over, you know, the river. I don't like the word illegal. It just seems to be, you live in a certain space. I just think it was sort of a paradox or a dynamic of the region at the time, you know, and when the river actually had water, you know, for one. And so yeah, that story she told me when, you know, a while back, and that always stuck with me. And it was my brother Jose who told me that the name of the man, and that he was black. And so I always think that's an interesting dynamic for, you know, for race relations between, you know, Mexican Americans and African Americans and African blacks and on the border, you know. And so,
was it difficult for your mom to talk about some of these memories, in that memory in particular?
Not really. I mean, internally, what was happening with her, I don't know. But when she presented it to me, no, it wasn't. It wasn't this dramatic, you know, Valentin, sit down, we're gonna have coffee, I'm gonna talk to you. No, it was just very, you know, sort of matter of fact. You know, this is what went down. This is how it was back then. This is how we came to be. And I want to point out that at the same time she did that, but throughout having worked in the school districts at YISD in El Paso, and she became a legal citizen, you know, after getting her residency, and not her residency, but her citizenship. So, you know, she became, you know, legal.
So she's a citizen now.
She's a citizen, yes.
Okay. And talk about your upbringing then. You were born in Juarez?
No, I was not. That's one of the things, upon the first printing of the publication, I let my publisher know that, no, man, I sent you the proper info. I was not born in Juarez. My brothers and my sisters were born in Juarez. I'm first generation American. I was born in El Paso. So no, I'm born in El Paso.
And so then tell us about your upbringing with your brothers and your mom going it alone, basically.
Yeah, you know, it was living in the Kennedys and the Marmolejo projects, her being a single parent and living in, you know, in these apartments. It was, you know, it was tough. You know, El Paso at that point was had moments where it was, you know, there was a lot of gang warfare going on in some cases. I was never a part of it. I can never say that, you know, I was part of this or that, but I did witness some stuff. You know, that some activity that was pretty unsettling, and you know, and so we were moving around. She was looking for the right place, the right foundation to raise her children, and you know, there were some points, and there was one in particular that I've always had a hard time with the story, because just because it was pretty intense. And in the Marmolejos, there was two rival gangs. One was kicked out, and at one point I was playing basketball with a few friends of mine, and with a friend of mine, David Guante, and other guys, Gabriel Lopez from the apartments, and all of a sudden you see guys jumping of the walls from the apartments, and there's the rival gang was in the middle, and when you saw them coming over, all of us knew that something was going to go down wrong. So right off the bat, boom, we're like, let's go to your place, go to your apartment. I left my basketball, I ran back for the basketball. You see all these guys coming over, and sure enough, you had a shootout. These guys had, you know, machine guns, and I mean, it was really, it was a shootout in the Carolina apartments. The SWAT team showed up. I think 3 or 4 people were killed that day. And after that point, my mom was like, "Nah, this is just too much. We're gonna leave. We're gonna go somewhere else." And that was a reflection of the time of Boys in the Hood and Colors. I think a lot of times how film and art can imitate life and life imitate art. I think a lot of times that was a reflection of what was happening in Los Angeles. It was also what was happening in Texas and El Paso, and so it was a different landscape, you know. So that was one story. That's not emblematic of my whole time, you know, but
one that
did happen.
Remember.
You know, that did happen, and I did see that, you know. So that grows up with you, you know, and you think of how do you convert your, you know, those things that could otherwise afflict you and paralyze you into an asset. You know, how do you convert that into an asset? So, for one, you cathartically deal with the book. For another, you work on developing a cinematic voice. For one, you approach it as this could be the impetus for a telling story, a riveting story that isn't, you know, sort of accentuating essentially it's rather like a point of referencing your development and making commentary, you know, and developing a voice as a filmmaker or as a writer, poet.
Well, tell us about your career as a filmmaker, and what sort of work have you done, and has your prior experience inspired what you do now and what you put in your films, the kind of work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, I started off I dare say my film career with, you know, at UTEP with a wonderful professor, Cynthia Farah, and I had some, you know, I wrote a story about a heroin junkie, you know, and back in the day, a friend of mine was doing a story about, you know, of vampires, and you know, I'm like, no, man, you have something to say, you know, don't follow that motif. So I wrote a screenplay for him, and we produced it, and it got us the first award, you know, at UTEP in '96 for filmmaking, and it was just a very burgeoning period in El Paso and southern New Mexico.
And that was your first taste at filmmaking?
It was, and she got me in the loop with a lot of very important filmmakers. At that time, I had, you know, there was just a really good crew of filmmakers doing some work. There was a friend of mine, an attorney, Mario Alfaro, and then there was Jaime Cano, who's now teaching at UNAM, and you know, so and everybody went off to do their things in life. But I stuck to making movies and wanting to develop a voice, and I was lucky enough to work with you know, some prominent figures.
You spent some time in California.
No, and I did not. At that point, California was coming to El Paso.
Oh.
The same way that they're coming to Albuquerque and northern New Mexico. And at that point, prior to the film incentives and the initiatives, they were maximizing on lack of unions in Texas, in West Texas primarily, in El Paso. So you had, like, for 5 years, you had Miramax, New Line Cinema. You had a whole slew of big studios come in and do their work here, and I was lucky enough to be a part of all that, and
what
I got
did you
to
do and on
I,
what
you know,
films?
I worked on Traffic. I was everything from production assistant to office PA to camera assistant to actor. I got my SAG card when I was 19. I got to buddy up with Benicio del Toro. I was his stand-in on Traffic. I got to work with Christopher Walken and Bruce Willis. I got to work with I got a job offer with Casey Affleck and Heather Graham and Luke Wilson on Committed. But I went ahead and I found a point where you figure out, you think of, what do you want to do? You want to develop a voice, or you want to have a job, you know, in the industry. So
Tough decision.
yeah,
Tough call.
yeah. So I left my sort of my work in Hollywood, you know, and then I went off into working with nonprofits like La Fe Clinic and you know, Cafe Mayapan, and just want to develop a voice inside of El Paso to capture the nuances of the region, you know, of the issues that are affecting the, you know, Juarez, El Paso, but at the same time contextualize them with the fact that I do want to tell a story. I do want to make broader commentaries. I do want to, you know, put it on the map per se. So.
And have you put together your own work since then, in film, documentary?
Yeah, I haven't put together a full-length feature film. I did one called The Grey Aquidea with John Leo DeFrank, but we went ahead and broke that one off into 12-minute segments for webisodes, and I've done music video work with the other folk out of Phoenix and here. I've gotten to work with Jimmy Santiago Baca in Albuquerque doing documentary work. I've gotten to work with political work in Albuquerque, in Santa Fe, and also done documentary work for the SEIU, the union out of DC, and Mi Familia Vota. It's very, you know, in the scope of impacting, you know, global politics. I've gotten to go there, so I've been able to leverage the experiences to go and have an impact in film. But I'm still working to I hope this book here becomes one of my first foray into full-length feature films, you know, where I tell the story cinematically.
Meaning you hope that this can turn into a
yes.
screenplay.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So so now that the book is done, what's next? Are you touring around? Where can we see you?
I'm doing a Somos over in Taos, New Mexico. It's a organization that's been around for 35 years, and it's a big literary conference. July 29th, I'll be on there with John Nichols, and there's a whole slew of internationally recognized authors and New York Times best-selling writers, and so I'll be there, presenting my book and getting the word out and pushing that. I've been touring. I did Monterey Bay, I did Berkeley, I did Albuquerque, Houston, Dallas, Austin, and so the whole point is just to get the word out with the book and just present your narrative and put it on the radar. So.
And any events around this neighborhood in southern New Mexico or West Texas in the works?
I have a book reading July 13th at Barnes & Noble's on the west side of El Paso, which is going to be, I guess they're coming up with a new version of To Kill a Mockingbird, and they invited me to go there and read it alongside Bobby Bird and the senator, of El Paso there on Monday. So I'll be doing that. I haven't done anything in Las Cruces yet. I hope to
You should
do
plan
so. I would love to. Yes. Anybody out there want any ideas? I'm open.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you for coming here today, Valentin, and congratulations on your new book, and much luck on the road talking about it.
Thank you. Thank you.
This has been Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Mónica Ortiz Uribe.